The crystal flute snapped in my hand. That's how silent the room had gone. A moment before, the dining hall of the Sterling estate had been a cacophony of silver scraping porcelain and the performed laughter of people who hate each other, but love money. Then my father, Richard Sterling, cleared his throat. He stood at the head of the mahogany table, a table I had refinished for him by hand 3 years ago, stripping away decades of rot to make it look pristine again, and he looked right at me. He didn't look with affection. He looked with the weary irritation of a man finding a stain on his cuff. "Elias," he said, his voice projecting that polished boardroom baritone that had charmed investors for 40 years. "We've been discussing the restructuring for the new merger. The optics need to be streamlined, leaner, more dynamic." He paused, letting the heavy silence settle over the roast duck. "And the truth is, you simply take up space. You're not a closer. You're not a face for the brand, and frankly, having you linger in the guest wing at your AG, it dilutes the image of success we're selling. We need that space for the new VP of acquisitions. You understand." My brother, Marcus, snorted into his wine glass. My stepmother, Alana, didn't even look up from her plate, but the corner of her mouth twitched upward. It wasn't just a dismissal. It was a public evisceration. The space I took up wasn't just a room. He was erasing my contribution to the family legacy entirely. They waited for me to beg. They waited for the flush of embarrassment, the stammered apology for existing. I looked down at the stem of the flute in my hand, now 2 jagged pieces. A singular drop of blood welled on my thumb. I didn't feel pain. I felt a sudden, terrifying clarity. I looked at the grandfather clock in the corner. 7:03 p.m. "You're evicting me," I said, my voice quiet. "We're relocating resources," Richard corrected, smiling as if teaching a slow child. "Don't be dramatic. We'll give you a severance. Enough for a deposit on an apartment. Somewhere simpler." The laughter rippled around the table again. Marcus chimed in. "Maybe a studio, Eli. Less to clean." I placed the broken glass on the tablecloth. The red wine began to bleed into the white linen, spreading like a dark omen. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. I tapped the screen once. A notification I had been dreading and hoping for flashed green. "That's funny," I said, standing up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor, because at 7:00 p.m., the non-compete clause in my contract expired, and at 7:01 p.m., the automated transfer of the intellectual property rights for the Horizon designs completed. Richard frowned. "What are you babbling about?" "The Horizon project," I said, meeting his eyes. "The flagship development that's supposed to save this family from bankruptcy next quarter. You signed the initial proposal, Dad, but you never read the technical addendums. I developed the structural patents in my own time, on my own dime, before I officially joined the firm. You leased them from me. You didn't buy them." The room went dead. "The lease was month to month," I continued, buttoning my jacket. "And I just canceled it." "You can't do that." Marcus spat, standing up. "That's company property." "It's intellectual property," I corrected. "And it's leaving with me. Tonight. I'm not taking up space anymore, Richard. I'm taking the foundation." I walked out of the dining room while they were still processing the shock. The sound of my footsteps the only thing louder than their sudden, suffocating panic. Before I tell you how I brought the Sterling Empire to its knees without raising my voice, I have to ask, where are you listening from right now? Are you in a car, parked in a driveway you don't want to leave because the house inside doesn't feel like home? Are you washing dishes in a kitchen where you feel invisible? Drop your flag in the comments. I want to know who's out there, building their own tables in the dark. To the outside world, the Sterlings were American royalty. We were the architects of the modern skyline. If you saw a gleaming spire in Chicago or a brutalist masterpiece in Boston, chances are a Sterling cut the ribbon. We appeared to be a phalanx of jawlines and tailored suits, moving in perfect synchronization. Richard Sterling was the visionary patriarch. Marcus was the charismatic heir apparent. Alana was the philanthropic soul. And I was there. If you look closely at the family portraits, you'd see it. I was always slightly out of focus, or standing on the periphery. The lighting was never quite right on me. In the magazine spreads, I was listed as also pictured. The narrative was that I was the soft one, the creative one who lacked the killer instinct. While Marcus was being groomed in boardrooms, I was in the workshop in the basement, covered in sawdust and drafting dust. But here is the hidden truth. The Sterling Empire was hollow. It was a beautiful facade with termites in the framing. Richard hadn't had a genuine, original idea since the late 90s. He was a master of leverage, moving debt from one shell company to another to keep the lights on. Marcus couldn't read a blueprint to save his life. He was a salesman who thought charm could replace structural integrity. They were bleeding cash, hemorrhaging reputation, and terrified that the world would find out. I wasn't just the creative one. I was the engine. For 10 years, every award-winning design, every cost-saving innovation, every solution that prevented a catastrophic lawsuit, it came from my desk. I ghostwrote Marcus's speeches. I redrew Richard's impossible sketches into buildable realities. I fixed the messes they made and let them take the credit because I believed that was my role. I believed that if I made myself indispensable, eventually they would have to love me. I was wrong. Usefulness is not love. To a narcissist, usefulness is just fuel. And when you burn too bright, they don't admire the light. They resent the shadow it casts on them. The wound didn't start at that dinner. It started when I was 7. I remember building a complex model of a suspension bridge out of balsa wood. I spent weeks on it, calculating the load, bearing tension with a precocity that should have been celebrated. I brought it to my father in his study. He was on the phone. He didn't even look at me. He just waved his hand, a shooing motion that became the defining gesture of my childhood. I tripped, the bridge shattered, and he finally looked at me. Not with concern, but with annoyance at the noise. "Clean that up," he said. "And try to be quieter, Elias. You take up so much air." That was the refrain. I was too loud, too messy, too intense, too present. I learned to shrink. I learned to make myself small. I moved into the guest house voluntarily when I was 22, thinking the distance would make them respect my boundaries. Instead, it just made it easier for them to ignore me until they needed something fixed. While they partied in the Hamptons, I was studying sustainable architecture and advanced materials science. While Marcus was crashing sports cars, I was acquiring certifications in urban planning. I built a portfolio under a pseudonym, Vanguard, just to see if my work could stand on its own. It did. Vanguard won contests. Vanguard got job offers. But I turned them down, staying loyal to the family, staying in the guest house, waiting for my turn. The dinner was the catalyst, but the true betrayal, the one that turned my sadness into cold iron, happened 3 days before the eviction. I had been working on the Horizon project for 8 months. It was a massive eco-friendly residential complex that relied on a specific, revolutionary geothermal heating system I had designed. It was the only way to make the project profitable. Without that system, the maintenance costs would bankrupt the developers within 5 years. I went into Richard's office to drop off the final schematics. He wasn't there. His computer was unlocked. I know I shouldn't have looked, but I saw an email chain with the subject line, Post, Merger Org Chart. I clicked it. I saw Richard's name, CEO, Marcus COO, Alana Board Director. There were names of people I'd never heard of filling every VP and director slot. I scrolled down, looking for my name. I assumed I would be head of design, maybe chief technical officer. I found my name at the very bottom, under a section titled, External Consultants as Needed. And then I saw the next email in the chain, from Richard to Marcus. Once the merger goes through and we secure the funding for Horizon, we cut Elias loose. We don't need him on payroll. We'll own the designs by then. We can hire a junior draftsman to manage the implementation for 1/10 of the cost. He's becoming a liability with his constant questions about the budget. Let him go play artist somewhere else. Marcus's reply was a single line. Finally. He's depressing to be around. They weren't just firing me. They were stealing my life's work and planning to discard me like a used napkin. They were going to defraud the investors by swapping out my oversight for a junior draftsman. Knowing full well the system required expert management, they were setting the project up to fail in the long run, but they'd have their payout by then. I didn't cry. I didn't smash the computer. I felt a strange, icy calm settle over my chest. It was the feeling of a prisoner realizing the cell door has been unlocked the whole time. I realized then that I had given them the power to hurt me. I had handed them the knife and bared my throat, begging them to spare me. But if I took the knife back, they were defenseless. That's when I remembered the loophole. The Horizon patents. I had filed them under my own LC, Vanguard Systems. 2 years ago, purely for liability reasons. I had leased the rights to Sterling Corp for a nominal fee of $1 a month, renewable monthly. I walked out of that office and went straight to my lawyer. We drafted the termination notice. We set the timer for 7:10 p.m. on the night of the merger dinner. The strategy phase was 3,000 miles long. After I walked out of the dinner, I didn't go to a hotel. I went to the airport. I flew to Seattle. Why Seattle? Because 3 years prior I had bought an old, dilapidated warehouse on the waterfront using my trust fund. Money my mother had left me that Richard couldn't touch. He thought I had wasted it on hippie nonsense. I had been slowly renovating it remotely, preparing it for something. I didn't know what, until now. I landed in the rain. It felt like a baptism. I took a cab to the warehouse. It was raw, cold, and smelled of cedar and salt. It was perfect. I didn't answer my phone. I had 47 missed calls from Marcus. 12 from Richard. A text from Alana, darling, let's not be hasty. Come back for dessert. I turned the phone off. I bought a burner. For the next 6 weeks, I didn't exist to them. I became a ghost. But in the industry, I was suddenly very real. I legally rebranded Vanguard Systems. I reached out to the investors who were backing the Horizon project. I didn't badmouth my family. I didn't have to. I simply sent them a technical dossier proving that the Horizon project, as it currently stood without my IP, was legally unbuildable and structurally unsound. I included the termination of rights notice. I met with the zoning board. I met with the Environmental Commission. I quietly pointed out the flaws that the junior draftsman would inevitably miss. Meanwhile, in Seattle, I was building, not just a business, but a physical table. I bought reclaimed timber, massive slabs of Douglas fir from an old mill. I spent my days sanding, planing, and joining. It was meditative. Every stroke of the sandpaper was erasing a layer of their conditioning. You take up space. Scrape. You're too loud. Scrape. You're nothing. Scrape. The table I built was 12 feet long. Solid, unbreakable. It occupied the center of my new open plan office. It was a statement. This table demanded space, and I sat at the head of it. Back east, the Sterling Empire was catching fire. Without the rights to my heating system, the Horizon project was dead in the water. The investors pulled their funding. The merger stalled. The bank called in the loans Richard had leveraged against the project. They tried to sue me, of course. They filed an emergency injunction claiming I had stolen company property. But my documentation was impeccable. I had emails where Richard explicitly stated, "Handle the patents yourself. Elias, I don't want the company liable for your experimental garbage." He had signed his own death warrant years ago, out of arrogance. The injunction was dismissed. Then came the silence, the panic, and finally the reach out. It wasn't a threat this time. It was a summons. Richard emailed. "Family meeting." I replied, "I'm busy building. If you want to talk, you come to me." I gave them an address in Seattle. They flew commercial. That was the first tell. The private jet was evidently grounded. The confrontation happened on a Tuesday morning. It was raining again, gray sheets of water hitting the large industrial windows of my office. Richard and Marcus walked in. They looked smaller. Richard's suit was wrinkled. He had clearly slept in it. Marcus looked like he hadn't slept in a week. His eyes were rimmed with red, and his hands were shaking. They stopped at the door, looking at the space. My space, the high ceilings, the buzzing activity of 20 brilliant young architects and engineers I had hired. People who were actual visionaries, not nepo babies. And in the center, the table. I didn't stand up. I sat at the head of the table, reviewing a schematic on my tablet. "Elias," Richard said. His voice lacked the boom. It sounded thin. "Richard," I said, not looking up. "Marcus. Take a seat, if you can find one." There were no chairs at the other end of the table. I had removed them. They had to stand. "This has gone on long enough," Richard said, trying to summon the old authority. "You've made your point. You've embarrassed us. You've cost the family millions. Now, sign the rights back over. We're willing to offer you a percentage, a consulting fee, a generous consulting fee," Marcus added, his voice cracking. "And you can come back. We'll give you your room back." I finally looked up. I looked at them, really looked at them, and I realized I felt nothing. No anger, no hate, just the indifference of a mountain looking at a bug. I don't think you understand the situation, I said calmly. I'm not negotiating for a room in a house I don't want, and I'm certainly not negotiating with a company that doesn't exist. What do you mean? Richard snapped. I bought the debt, I said. Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. The bridge loan you took out to cover the operational costs while the merger went through. The one with the predatory interest rate. The bank sold it this morning, to Vanguard Systems. Richard grabbed the edge of the table, my table. Yeah, you can't. I can. And I did. Which means I technically own the Sterling estate. I own the office building in Boston. I own the chairs you're standing next to. Marcus looked like he was going to be sick. Ollie, please. We're family. Family. I stood up then. Family is the people who make space for you. You told me I took up space, so I left. And now, I own the space. I walked around the table and stood in front of my father. He looked old, frail. Here are your options, I said, my voice steady. Option A, Lee. I foreclose. Today you lose everything. The house, the firm, the name. You file for personal bankruptcy. You end up in that simple apartment you joked about. Richard flinched. Option B, I continued. You sign over full control of Sterling Corp to me. You retire. Permanently. You issue a public statement citing health reasons. Marcus, you resign. You can keep your trust fund, but you will never step foot in a Sterling office again. In exchange, I will refinance the debt. I will let you keep the house in the Hamptons. Life estate only. It reverts to me when you pass. You keep your dignity, or what's left of it. But the company is mine. You would destroy your own father, Richard whispered. I didn't destroy you, Dad, I said softly. You built a house of cards. I just opened a window. I slid a folder across the table. You have 1 hour to decide. Then I call the lawyers. I turned my back on them and walked to the window, watching the rain wash the city clean. Behind me, I heard the scratch of a pen on paper. It was the loudest sound I had ever heard. The aftermath wasn't explosive. It was quiet. Richard retired. The official story was heart trouble. In a way, it was true. His heart had failed him years ago. He just hadn't noticed until it cost him his empire. He spends his days in the Hamptons staring at the ocean. We don't talk. Marcus moved to Los Angeles. He tried to start a lifestyle brand. It failed. He's currently trying to become an influencer. I watch his stories sometimes. He looks tired. As for me, I didn't move back to the East Coast. I stayed in Seattle. I absorbed the Sterling assets into Vanguard. We renamed the company Foundry. I didn't fire everyone at Sterling. I found the other people like me, the quiet ones, the ones in the back of the photos, the ones doing the work while the bosses took the credit. I promoted them. I gave them space. I met someone too. Her name is Sarah. She's a landscape architect. When she moved in, she brought a massive collection of pottery wheels and clay. It took up half the living room. Is this okay? She asked, looking worried. It takes up a lot of space. I looked at her, and I looked at the wheel, and I smiled. Take up as much space as you need, I said. We can always build a bigger room. Last week, I flew back east to inspect the old Sterling headquarters. We were converting it into affordable housing and a community design lab. I walked into the old dining room. The table, the one where they laughed at me, was still there. I ran my hand over the mahogany. I remembered the boy who sat there, shrinking, bleeding, desperate for a crumb of approval. I felt a wave of compassion for him. I called the foreman over. This table, I said. Get rid of it. Sell it, he asked. No, I said. Chop it up. Use it for firewood. We're bringing in something new. We are not defined by the tables we are forced to sit at. We are defined by the ones we build for ourselves. If you are currently shrinking to fit into someone else's narrative, stop. Stand up. Walk out. The world is vast, and there is land out there with your name on it. Don't be afraid to take up space. Be afraid of disappearing into someone else's shadow. I'm Elias Sterling, and this is the view from the head of the table. If this story resonated with you, if you're planning your own exit, or if you've already built your own table, tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one, and if you're not there yet, stay tuned. I've got more blueprints to share.